I do have another. This is going to be a longer story, and this is about housing advocates and I started cutting this one, and it just kept going and going and going and going, and I'm like, wow, this is our vegetables we're gonna have to eat tonight. So I'm telling you now, stick with us because this is a good one. But this is really important because this is how activists are making the right to housing a reality. Like from waging nonviolence, and we like to certainly wage nonviolence. Blocking the street outside the court in Brooklyn to extend the eviction moratorium. People still owe money. Shout out again.
Still owe money.
Shout out again to Jesse Jett. We played. What did we play tonight for the first time? There was a one of the songs that we'd put up that we had not previously put up, and it's got Franco shouting at AOC and Cori Bush. People still owe money. So what's going on? Backed by faith communities, the housing justice movement is racking up wins against landlords and banks profiting off of what should be a human right. So we're going to hear about this story about April Lewis. She's in a housing fight again. This time she's pushing to keep dozens of families from being put out of a Charlotte extended stay motel that's scheduled to be shut down in a matter of weeks. Such motels cost as much as $500 each week. Expensive each week. Expensive compared to long-term housing, but many of these families are living paycheck to paycheck or on fixed incomes and have no other option. Why? Because they can't afford the move-in costs for an apartment. Landlords want upfront rent and utilities and a security deposit, and now they're making even more people pay for rental insurance. Now they want first and last and utility and sometimes 2.5 months rent just to move in. Others stay at the motel because they're shut out of traditional housing due to a past eviction or criminal record. Now, I have a friend, a Facebook friend. Her name is Kate, and she is currently homeless. And she's dealing with, and she's in Oceanside. I've been trying to help her, and I have not, unfortunately, been able to do enough to help her. But it is a real problem, and it's one that is continuing to grow in this country. And one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this. Some simply can't. Sad. It's really sad. It's heartbreaking because she's she lost her husband, she lost her pet, and then she lost her place to live, and now she's out on the street and completely like starting to lose it because of her mental state of grief. And there's no relief. It's really hard. So some simply can't find a suitable place to live in a time when rental vacancies are at historic lows, right? Because rents are jacked up, can't find a place you can afford. What are you going to do? The good news for the motel residents is that this is not Lewis's first fight. An organizer for Action North Carolina, Lewis coordinated cancel rent protests at the local courthouse in the early days of COVID pandemic, led tenants in chants of housing is human right at various government meetings, and organizers canvassing in phone banks, pulling together tenants to advocate for their rights. God's work. Current focus is calling out corporate landlords like the one in Charlotte who was repeatedly cited for refusing to address rampant mold, vermin, and dangerous wiring. It really bugs me. In early September, Lewis and other tenants joined with other organizations that, like Action North Carolina, are affiliated with Center for Popular Democracy, make an uninvited appearance at the Washington, D.C. meeting of a trade association of corporate landlords. Dozens of tenants took over a conference room, poured themselves glasses of the fancy lemon and orange-infused water, and chanted, "Corporate landlord, you can't hide. We can see your greedy side." I love it. All right. We go everywhere, Lewis said. We not only go door to door, we do banner drops and disrupt official meetings. Just be there and be loud so they can't ignore what's happening to these tenants. Lewis has fought for her own housing, too. That's always how it works. A single mom, she more than once had to scramble to keep from being evicted despite working 2 and sometimes 3 jobs. The rent kept going up, and so I had to be pretty crafty just so I could keep my daughter housed. When Lewis later began working with youth and families as a counselor, the challenges they shared with her kept coming back to housing, far and away the top expense at most U.S. households, right? And right now, again, with costs escalating everywhere, The tenants she works with are not alone. More than 10 million U.S. renters report being behind on their rent. That's an imminent risk of eviction. I know of 3 or 4 people who I've spoken to in the last week, people who we all know that are concerned and are housing unstable right now. 65% of those behind on their on their rent are also people of color. These Americans desperately need housing assistance, but unlike Medicaid or SNAP food stamps, federal housing programs are not an entitlement. Families and individuals may qualify for housing help, but they only get that assistance if there's supply available, and it's usually not available. Only 1 in 4 eligible persons are able to receive a federal housing subsidy, leaving over 8 million households eligible but unsupported. As grim as those numbers are, they may soon be getting worse, because rent prices on average rose more than 16% during 2021 and went up more than 20% in some cities, which we also know. Orlando specifically, we know has had.
Yep.
A recent study by the US GAO found that every $100 in average monthly rent increases is associated with a 9% increase in homelessness. So it's no surprise that by mid this year, homeless shelters were reporting a surge in people asking for help, with wait lists doubling and tripling as a result. And then you've got corporate landlords and, of course, housing racism. So the U.S. is often referred to as having free market economic system, but housing in this country doesn't remotely resemble an unfettered market. Federal, state, and local governments have eagerly assumed roles as major players in the housing business. Problem is that the government's heavy hand in housing is usually placed on the scales on the side of the wealthy. As we probably know, that over the past decade, corporations have taken advantage of significant tax breaks to dramatically increase their holdings of both multi-unit rental properties and residential homes. Institutional owners or corporations or LLCs now own the majority of all U.S. rental units and 80% plus of the properties with 25 or more units. I don't think that's much of a surprise. Even people that are individuals put those buildings into LLCs or corporations.
Yep.
As Lewis and others familiar with U.S. rental homes can attest, this is a problem. Yes, I agree. Corporations are demonstrably more eager to evict and less responsive to maintenance needs than similar landlords. Tenants struggle with out-of-state landlords that leave mold unaddressed, broken appliances, windows unrepaired, trash not picked up, and even fail to pay water and other services. And too often they can blame people living there, like saying they don't keep their homes clean. Corporate landlords should be regulated like banks. Why not?
Which banks aren't regulated now, but yeah, I feel you.
Right. So, U.S. housing dysfunction is grounded in the long legacy of racist housing practices. Of course, we're talking about during the early and mid 20th century, the federal government used home ownership subsidies to benefit whites and exclude blacks, while restrictive covenants prevented blacks from moving to the neighborhoods where mortgages were easier to obtain. That's redlining. With home ownership, the top means for accumulating wealth in the U.S., generations of housing and income discrimination has left black home ownership rates and wealth far below those of their white counterparts. Housing racism is the core reason why U.S. white households have on average 10x the wealth of black households. And the trends continue today. The current scourge of absentee corporate landlords and speculative purchasing of homes is disproportionately visited on black and brown communities, and is a trend reminiscent of corporate purchases made in those same communities during the Great Recession of 07 to 09, when during the recession, black household wealth, much of it dependent on home values, fell nearly 50%. And that all leads to grimly predictable outcomes. Great. Black families are more than twice as likely to be renters as white families, and among renters, black families are far more likely to be evicted than white renters, with black women and children the most likely of all to be thrown out of their home. Yeah, because let's do that. Just Monsters.
Yep.
Absolute monsters. Nearly 1 in 5 Black or Hispanic children have experienced eviction by age 15. Wow.
Yeah, that's fucking bullshit. Anyway.
A lot of things in housing haven't changed since the Jim Crow era. To address it, we have to address the racism. So, what are we doing about this? So, the good thing is we've got people, activists like April Lewis, who have the public's attention. Polls show both a great deal of contemporary concern about housing. Well, because they mostly out of selfishness, because they don't want to see homeless people on the side of the road, but also out of compassion for wanting to see people get off the street and get into homes and be safe and have privacy and so many other things that go along, a shower and running water. Housing, commitment to remedying the problem, right? A 2021 survey showed that 2/3 of Americans growing in metropolitan areas are extremely or very concerned about homelessness and the high cost of housing, ranking it as their top priority. Quote, housing is the most critical component for a successful community. A lot of issues we're struggling with, like crime, are connected to people not being able to stay housed. Sure. At a more individual level, housing insecurity is associated with all manner of health crises, from asthma and heart disease to violence and suicide. If you are not secure in your housing, your mental health is in jeopardy. And actually, we talked about my friend Kate. You're always stressing. You're always at level 10 because you're fighting for housing. I can tell you myself that me sitting here in a comfortable position in my housing, my thought patterns are way better than when I was struggling to stay housed. I also want to mention, how sometimes folks like this, they get a storage locker because they don't have a place to keep their stuff. And then it's getting to and from the storage locker and being able to afford a cell phone and a storage locker so that you can at least afford to exist in this world. I mean, without ID and without, again, a lot of them don't even have enough for a storage locker and to put their stuff, a place for my stuff, as the legend George Carlin famously had talked about. Again, this is like I said, this is a little bit of vegetables, but we're gonna get through this, and we got not much more. But it should be no surprise that surveys show that 3/4 of Americans agree with the tenants' chance in Charlotte and around the nation. Safe, secure housing should be considered a human right. Again, this sounds like the Medicare for all argument. Everybody agrees, but somehow it's not happening. Those Americans are not content for that right to be an abstraction. The vast majority of people expressing support of housing as a human right also support expanded government programs to make that right a reality. Federal level housing efforts include Ilhan Omar's Homes for All Act, which would devote $1 trillion to building 12 million new, permanently affordable public and social housing units. How much profit is there for developers in that? It would also,
I doubt very much,
repeal the Faircloth Amendment, which in 1998 responded to the deterioration of public housing by blocking new public housing construction. What? Yeah. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition is leading a housed campaign in the U.S. in the middle of housed to expand rental assistance to every eligible household and create a national housing stabilization fund to provide emergency help. Meanwhile, there's a robust and successful activism going on at the state and local level. There is robust and successful activism going on at the state and local levels, which is great. Activists using tactics ranging from occupying vacant buildings to canvassing to pushing ballot initiatives have won commitments for expanded affordable housing support in cities like Minneapolis, Oakland, Philly, San Fran, Baltimore, Los Angeles. Community activists are engaged in current housing campaigns in Vegas and New York. Rent control advocacy is ongoing in California, Florida, Michigan, with a recent rent control victory in Minnesota. Right? San Francisco is now requiring landlords to recognize and meet with tenant associations or face mandated rent reduction. Activists in cities like Indianapolis are persuading their local governments to follow the European example of directing public real estate and public funding to social housing. Amazing. Religious communities are engaged with the movement also. The Federal Housed campaign is joined by Catholic Charities USA, the Union for Reform Judaism, and the national leadership of the Episcopal and Methodist churches. I wonder if they've invited any Muslim organizations. My guess would be probably not, but they should.
Yeah, I agree.
As for the Action North Carolina housing effort in Charlotte, it counts as a key ally. It counts as a key ally, St. Martin's Episcopal Church. We should call up Matthew Ho, running for Senate in North Carolina, see if he's involved with these guys at all. Several homeless people live on the downtown Charlotte grounds of St. Martin's, and the congregation welcomes and supports them. After a group visit to the local eviction court and conversations with several of the Action North Carolina leaders, the congregation decided to focus on housing justice. We wanted to see how we could be of help before a family becomes evicted or someone becomes homeless, Mission Board President Kay Miller said. Great, thank goodness. So St. Martin's parishioners have staffed a tenant crisis hotline and recruited pro bono attorneys to help families facing eviction. That's awesome. A new team is pulled together to do phone canvassing of tenants living in some of the worst corporate-owned housing in Charlotte. They're discussing the possibility of following other churches' leads and helping low-income homeowners pay off property tax bills and fines that often causes a family to lose a home, and even exploring how to help create more affordable housing units. I give credit to the people of St. Martin's for showing us how community and faith-based groups can really help the movement, Lewis said. I try to push faith groups into action, not just praying. They're definitely taking action. They're offering more than thoughts and prayers. And social, not-for-profit housing is the last section that we're dealing with here. So, again, a common theme of activism, right, is the need to move away from expectations that the private for-profit market will solve our crisis. And again, I think a lot of the capitalist movement, quote unquote, the people who don't have capital but are so gung-ho for capitalism, this is where they step in. So the big picture and KYT, I don't remember, I butcher names, is written in her book, Race for Profit, is it entrusting a human right to profit-seeking entities will inevitably lead to suffering. Right? Satisfying basic human needs like the provision of shelter, medical treatment, water, or even education run counter to businesses' objective of maximizing return on investment or simply making money. One of the most pressing questions has been how to secure the provision of safe, sound, affordable, and decent housing for everyone. The obstacles to that goal have always been businesses' bottom line. Right? So, increasingly, activists have been able to convince state and city governments that Taylor's right. The private housing market will never meet the needs of everyone in their communities. States like Rhode Island, Hawaii, and Colorado are investing in building government-run housing, as are communities like Montgomery County, Maryland. What? Yeah. Governments at all levels hold the power to solve the housing crisis. They can raise revenue for subsidized housing by taxing high-end housing and housing speculation. They can tightly regulate for-profit housing activity and exercise eminent domain, especially on vacant or distressed corporate properties. Governments can significantly increase the resources and power of public land banks to acquire property and transfer or develop it into affordable housing, pass Community Opportunities to Purchase Act, or COPA, legislation, right, which gives them the first rights of land purchase to tenants and the community. It's interesting. So the community actually can buy back the land from the corporations if it's not being developed, and then figure out what to do with it themselves. Governments can then subsidize those organizations' development, right, and maintenance efforts via public housing finance agencies. So literally, like, the government can support all of this if we figure out how to do it and navigate the paperwork. Housing activists' demands like these are often framed with the term social housing. Social housing is publicly owned by either the government or nonprofit organizations that respond to democratic control by residents. It's decommodified, protected from the profiteering of the private market, and affordable for the life of the building or unit with no expiration date. Social housing sees housing as a human right, not as a commodity or wealth building tool. Like public education, public safety, our justice system, and infrastructure like roads and sewers and water, social housing recognizes that a place to live is a good that is too important to be left dependent on whether a family has enough money to ensure a profit to a private landlord or bank. Wow, what a novel concept. April Lewis, she helped advise Center for Popular Democracy in its manifesto in support of social housing published in March of this year. In Minnesota and New York, activist pressure led to corporate-owned properties being converted to community ownership, while public dollars for affordable housing are being raised in San Francisco via taxes on high-end real estate. How interesting. COPA legislation is passed or is pending in multiple states and communities, including D.C. and Portland. Baltimore Community Advocacy successfully forced the creation of a housing trust fund, and North Dakota, Philly, and California now have public banks to fund social housing. We got to do something. One social housing approach enjoying significant current momentum is community land trusts, which have a legacy that traces back to Black-owned projects like the new communities that grew out of the Southern U.S. civil rights movement. In a community land trust, the nonprofit trust retains ownership of the land while the resident purchases the house on it. The purchase cost is lowered due to the discount for not buying the land, and the purchase is often supported with subsidies. In addition, for the reduced price and the subsidy, the resident's resale price is limited in order to make sure the home is permanently affordable. And there are now over 225 community land trusts in the United States, with local governments supporting them by acquiring land and buildings from private ownership and transferring title to the trusts to develop and manage. Why? The rationale behind all these campaigns is simple. Okay, so a housing organizer for the CPD says, we just need to prioritize renters the way we've been doing for landlords. If there's a will, there's definitely a way. Right? And again, an impressive history of housing activism supports her optimism. This is really cool because in nations like Finland and France and Singapore, they have far more affordable housing and far less homelessness than the United States. There are other models we can follow. The impressive social housing track record in those and other nations came about because of advocacy, including tenant and labor union campaigns in Sweden, grassroots organizing in Germany, for expropriating corporate landlord property, right? Activists occupying banks and homes in Spain, a broad socialist movement in Austria, Finland, Germany, South Africa, France, Netherlands, multiple countries. They created legal rights to housing and followed up the pronouncements with the programs to ensure their enforcement. How about that? Like, housing is a legal right is actually a legal right in some countries around the world. Did you know that?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay. In Scotland, for example, which has enshrined a right to housing in its constitution and legislation, homelessness is brief, rare, and a non-recurring phenomenon. Okay?
Even Glasgow.
Even Glasgow.
Glasgow.
Right? The U.S. has its own record of successful housing activism. Rent strikes, community organizing led to rent control measures in 200 plus U.S. cities. Activism created the momentum for the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act in 1975, the Community Reinvestment Act in 1977, Dodd-Frank in 2010, right? St. Louis rent strike in 1969, first and still largest public housing rent strike, helped shape the Brooke Amendment of 1969. What's the Brooke Amendment? It capped public housing tenants' rent and increased federal subsidies for housing. Pretty important. Like other U.S. housing activism, the St. Louis strike had deep connections to faith communities. The strike was led in part by United Church of Christ minister Buck Jones and buttressed by broad support from the local religious congregations because they organize. They have the people.
Mm-hmm.
There's a shared theme among these movements. We can and must reclaim our housing system from those whose sole mission is to extract as much money as possible from people who need a roof over their heads to survive. It's a theme April Lewis keeps in mind as she fights alongside her fellow tenants. Our activism is radical, not violent, she said. You know, the violence is what's happening to these tenants, 100%. The bills keep coming and they're increasing, but of course we know wages are not. And then she repeated what tenants across the nation, in public meetings, corporate events, and street protesters are saying. At the end of the day, the rent is too damn high. Guy actually ran for mayor of New York City on that. And we are through our vegetables. Woohoo! Okay. So, housing does need to be a human right. We should make it illegal for hedge funds and private equity to buy up all the housing like they're doing. But then again, hedge funds and private equity have bought up our Congress and the corporations too. So I don't know how we're going to do that, but so there's a lot of positivity.
We've talked about a ton of like tenant unions and stuff like that recently. I know me and Colin have. Yep. I think there was a group, and I should know their names because I think they're associated with Assange for some reason. I think they're in the UK. Where
you're loud.
They I'm sorry.
That's okay. I fixed it.
I think that's your fault.
I fixed it.
That's you.
I fixed it.
So
need to shit down housing derivatives. That's absolutely right. Yeah, go ahead, squirrel. Thank you.
That were like breaking into like unused housing and like giving it to like homeless. Like they were like vigilante, like sort of thing, you know? I'm sure somebody knows what I'm talking about. I remember seeing stuff on Twitter with them like unlocking doors and stuff like that. You know, and saying that like housing was a right, you know?
Absolutely.